In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jaisal Noor. The weapons industry and their surrogates are furious the U.S. is leaving Afghanistan.
And as we have seen, the results of fully withdrawing can be, again, quite catastrophic.
Figures like General David Petraeus have plastered the airwaves to criticize the U.S. withdrawal without being held accountable for their part in the unfolding disaster and without disclosing their ties to weapon makers that have made fortunes off the war, as The Intercept has reported.
I think that the decision he made to pull all of our troops out and stop our air power support of the Afghans was a real mistake.
You know, in many ways, I think of John Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. It unfolded quickly, and the president thought that everything would be fine, and that was not the case.
The message was supposed to be clear. We will do what it takes and stay as long as it takes to protect our country.
These same defense contractors have mobilized, quote, $285 million in campaign contributions and $2.5 billion in lobbying spending to influence defense policy over the past 2 decades, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. And their efforts have paid dividends. During that same period, Congress awarded $2 trillion to the 5 biggest weapons companies. That's $2 trillion over the last 20 years. Well, now joining us to discuss all of this is Sarah Lazare, web editor and reporter for In These Times. She authored the piece, "We Can't Let the Generals Who Lied About the Afghanistan War Define Its Legacy." Thanks so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
So the world is obviously, watched in horror at the events in Afghanistan as they've unfolded. But the major media haven't done a great job in explaining how we got here. They've been ignoring this war for years. They haven't really talked about who has profited. As in your piece, you talk about when they're interviewing these former generals like Petraeus and other officials, they're not even talking about reported facts. Like, for example, the Afghanistan papers, which documented the lies that these military officials, have been saying for years, misleading the public, misleading different administrations. They've known the war was failing. They've known the Taliban had remained strong for reasons including U.S. enabling corruption, alliances with brutal warlords tied to human rights abuses, the occupation, thousands of civilians killed, allegations of war crimes, rape and torture. And we know this because of independent reporting and declassified internal military documents, which were all ignored. And it seems like they're largely continue to be ignored to this day. What's your response?
So the horrible conditions that we're seeing unfold in Afghanistan right now, following a 20-year violent and brutal U.S. occupation, should be cause for sober reflection on, imperial hubris, on the bipartisan pro-war consensus that got us here. But instead of that, what we're seeing is that the architects of this war, the generals, the ex-presidents, are getting to define its legacy. They're getting huge platforms in the press to come forward and say, here are the lessons that we've learned. This is really similar to having a police force investigate itself for wrongdoing. These are the people who are directly responsible. You mentioned Petraeus, and I want to drill down on him because he really sticks out as someone who has been on a charm offensive ever since Biden moved forward with the withdrawal, going on cable news across the political spectrum, being quoted in numerous media outlets. Petraeus is very, very good at media spin. It's something he did during his positions in the U.S. military. So Petraeus was commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011. During that time, He implemented an aggressive and very violent counterinsurgency strategy that included loosening the rules of engagement, giving U.S. troops wider latitude to fire artillery, to destroy homes and buildings. He also increased notorious night raids. Night raids were some of the very violent acts that U.S. military carried out, terrorizing families while they slept. And he also dramatically increased airstrikes. So it's really interesting, given the prominent media role that he's playing right now, to look at the similar charm offensive that he was unleashing during that time. So he repeatedly held interviews while he was commander, saying that his strategy was working, things that we now know are false. At a July 2011 address at the Forum for New Diplomacy in Paris, I'll just quote directly. The New York Times paraphrases, quote, Mr. Petraeus called the Afghan army and police forces increasingly credible. He also described how they were steadily taking more responsibility from NATO allies as a gradual withdrawal of tens of thousands of U.S. troops loom. We now know that this is totally untrue. The Afghan government, the Afghan forces clearly lack legitimacy. You can tell that by the speed with which they fell. But also what's really interesting is that rosy picture contrasts pretty markedly with what he told government interviewers in 2017. This was revealed by the Afghanistan Papers, which was reported by the Washington Post. And he told government interviewers, I knew it was going to be a longer process. I had no expectations that we would be able to flip Afghanistan. And I just want to mention one other thing about Petraeus, which is that he is conflicted. He has ties to the military industry. He's on the board of Optiv Security, a military contractor, and he's a partner at KKR, which owns Navaria Group, which holds aerospace manufacturers. And that was reported by The Intercept. So, we have a situation where, it's very Kafkaesque. It's very frustrating and really sinister, because you have a situation where someone with a lot of blood on his hands, with current ties to the military industry, is getting to spin the meaning of what is happening right now, when there are a whole lot of other people who we could ask. For example, the people who were protesting the day after 9/11, saying our grief is not a cry for war. War will only end in catastrophe. That's not where the solution lies. Why aren't we talking to them instead of those generals and top military brass who are responsible?
Yeah, and absolutely. And figures like Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was the lone vote against giving the military, this endless amount of money, and like a war without an end, war without a timeline, which looks like it's finally coming to an end. But as we've talked about, there's figures within the military-industrial complex that don't want it to end. And it's just incredible to look at how much money these contractors have made. And, as someone that lives in Baltimore, and I believe you live in Chicago, there's so much unmet need at home when we're told there's just not enough money. There's not enough money for schools, there's not enough money for housing. And it's just astounding to I've watched several hours of interviews with these officials in the last couple of days, and you don't hear those questions being asked. You don't hear these officials being asked about, as you mentioned, their own statements within the last few years that have been uncovered, the overall impact of the war on Afghanistan or on at home. It's completely missed from this discourse. Do you think that it's important that the American people should know that, the top 5 defense contractors made $2 trillion in the past 2 decades, and then they went back and reinvested that money, spent it, spending billions in
you mentioned Barbara Lee, and she was the only member of Congress who had the courage right after September 11th to oppose publicly the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan. That was an incredibly jingoistic time. It was a time of narratives of revenge and war fervor. And it was a very tough time for those who were organizing against the war. There were a lot of people who did mobilize, who did protest. But there was an overwhelming air of sort of cowardice and conformity among electeds, among people in a position to actually do something to stop the war. The media firestorm that we're seeing now is not exactly the same, but I'm actually being brought back a little bit to that post 9/11 moment, because there is just this overwhelming push from press outlets across the spectrum that are goading Biden into staying in Afghanistan. It's been very frustrating because U.S. media outlets have systematically ignored civilian death and suffering in Afghanistan for years and years, and really are only willing to cover it when it's to build the case that we should not end a war. This sends a message to Biden, but also to the next president, that you better not think of ending a war lest you want to have a media revolt on your hands. I want to be clear that we should, of course, care about what people in Afghanistan are going through. This is not a call to stop covering it. There are very real issues. For example, the callousness with the United States is closing the door on refugees. But the whole enterprise is very cynical. The way that media outlets are sort of just being very smug and sanctimonious and self-righteous when they have had a direct hand in enabling U.S. violence and oppression and occupation in Afghanistan. So that's one thing that's very frustrating. And I really want to emphasize that these things don't come from out of nowhere. So you mentioned lobbying by the military industry, which is a huge political force. But there are also more circuitous ways that the military industry exerts its influence. A lot of the so-called experts who are trotted out in front of the press in moments like this, people from think tanks like the Institute for the Study of War, like CNAS and CSIS, a lot of those think tanks get considerable funding from the weapons industry. And it's a way that sort of, companies can avoid doing the dirty work of advocating and then have someone else do it for them. So just to give you an example, I was reading a earnings call from CACI International. CACI International is notorious to some of us who have been covering torture and the war on terror because they're being sued by people formerly detained at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. They're being accused of overseeing their torture. So I was looking through an August 12th earnings call, and CACI International repeatedly said to investors that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is hurting its profits. It used words like windfall. Windfall basically is another way of saying negative growth or decline in profits. And Afghanistan was mentioned 16 times just in that earnings call, just for the purpose of showing the harm caused by the withdrawal to the company, or for the purpose of sort of emphasizing that other growth elsewhere is offsetting those quote unquote windfalls. But the CEO of CACI International was careful not to say anything explicit on that call, saying we oppose the withdrawal. He sort of walked a careful line and simply stated the facts about declining profits. However, CACI International's CEO doesn't have to do that because CACI International is a quote-unquote corporate sponsor of the Institute for Study of War. And the Institute for Study of War calls itself a nonpartisan think tank, but it in fact is very partisan, especially when it comes to the Afghanistan war. It has been doing the media rounds, opposing withdrawal from Afghanistan. Its quote-unquote experts have appeared on Fox News repeatedly. So, There's nothing out of the ordinary about this sort of weapons contractor to pundit pipeline. It's actually very ordinary and very routine, but that's sort of part of the problem. The way the defense industry is able to launder its lobbying objectives through supposedly academic and rigorous and above the fray institutions that are then getting shrouded out in front of cameras right now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to end on one thought. The New York Times had a piece about a decade ago about the revolving door and the influence that the Pentagon has on these pundits, trotting them out. But I think one of the big key takeaways from that is it's because war is becoming increasingly unpopular, and they have to do these PR campaigns. They have to have these think tanks because people don't want to support these wars. They have to be convinced to support them. And we saw that with Iraq, the lead up to the Iraq War. They had to create support for it, and then as support for this 20-year war in Afghanistan has fallen, we see this new offensive sort of start again. I think that is a testament to all the people that have, the organizers and the activists and the peace activists and the veterans who have been there and now are back and are speaking out about what they saw and what they hope to come out of this situation. But yeah, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and recommend everyone checking out your work at In These Times. I know you have a new piece coming out, but the previous piece was titled "We Can't Let the Generals Who Lied About the Afghanistan War Define Its Legacy," and we'll link to that in this interview. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.